Karen O'Connor here. So I know that a number of you have been waiting ever so patiently for this second video of my breath management or breath support series. And if you stick around to the end, but don't skip ahead, you're going to get a little glimpse into my world that might explain to you or reveal to you why it is that I'm having such a hard time getting these videos out and why I've had to take multiple stabs at finishing this series. So what I've decided to do from here on out is take this topic of breath support or breath management and break it down into smaller sections so that it's a little bit more manageable for me and a little bit more digestible for you. And hopefully we'll be able to take all of these separate pieces and put them together like pieces of a puzzle. And I'm going to do my best as I'm teaching to try to help you see how they all sort of fit together so that you'll have a more comprehensive view of breath support. So today's teaching topic is subglottal pressure. Now subglottal pressure refers to the pressure beneath, the glottis. The glottis refers to the space between the vocal folds. So when we inhale, our rib cages expand and our diaphragms lower, and that increases the size of the thoracic cavity, the chest cavity. And that allows the lungs more space to expand when we draw in our breath. So then we inhale, and the lungs fill up with air, and now we have what's called an overpressure. But don't worry, have no fear. We need an overpressure inside our lungs. That is a pressure that's greater than that of the atmosphere outside the lungs in order to get the vocal folds vibrating and to be able to help us sustain our tones all the way through to the end of the vocal phrase. Subglottal pressure is a good thing unless it's too high or too low for the given singing task. So our jobs as singers is to be able to find an appropriate level of subglottal pressure for the particular task, to be able to sing the kinds of sounds that we're aiming to sing. So there are some tasks that require higher subglottal pressures. For example, very intense singing, very loud, belted singing. Those are high subglottal pressure tasks. When we're singing in an airier tone, there's a little bit of air leaking through the glottis, so there's less pressure inside the lungs. When we're singing softly in a piano dynamic, that's a lower subglottal pressure task, unless the glottal response is hyperfunctional. So there's a really interesting interconnectedness, a relationship between the subglottal pressures and the glottal response. So yes, the vocal folds do modulate or regulate the transglottal airflow. That is, they determine how much air passes through the glottis. But if we leave them to have to deal with this unrestrained pressure all on their own, they're very likely to respond in some sort of unhealthy, inefficient, or otherwise compensatory manner. Or worse yet, they could suffer damage. We want to be able to free up the vocal folds so that they can produce pitch and a strong source signal. We don't want them to be preoccupied with or solely responsible for holding back that compressed air. So what we have to do is find a way to mitigate that subglottal pressure, to keep it at appropriate levels. So yes, sometimes that subglottal pressure needs to be high, sometimes not. So we need to be able to find a way to get it so that it's just high enough, but not too high. That's the important distinction here. That is what's ultimately going to keep our instrument functioning in a very healthy manner. So this is where the support muscles come in. But it's probably not the support muscles that you've been taught to engage. So today I do want to touch upon this idea of the inspiratory hold, but I want to save the bulk of the teaching on that subject for a separate video because again, I'm trying to keep this video at a reasonable length today. And so I do want to go back to this idea first though of subglottal pressure and being able to manage those subglottal pressures. We just have to understand that breath support is a dynamic, flexible arrangement. So we don't just sort of set it and forget it. We have to be able to be free to adjust according to the dynamic variations in the song and from one part of the phrase to the next part, from the beginning to the end. Our subglottal pressure needs change all the time, and so we need to gain masterful control over our subglottal pressure. So one of the ways in which we can do that is to use the inspiratory hold, to employ the appoggio. Now, the appoggio is not the same as diaphragmatic breathing. Now, when I talk about the inspiratory hold, essentially what we're trying to do is we're aiming to try to keep the rib cage open just a little bit longer than what we would normally try to do when we're supporting diaphragmatically. And when we thrust our abdominal walls in like that, that forces the diaphragm to rise really, really quickly. But that again is not what the appoggio is, the traditional appoggio. In appoggio, the goal is actually to delay or to slow down the rise of the diaphragm so that we have greater control over our subglottal pressures. Again, that doesn't mean that we're not flexible in the approach. Sometimes we will engage more down here. Sometimes we will engage those expiratory muscles a little bit more. But what we're doing is we're keeping these inspiratory muscles engaged just a little bit to try to keep the expiratory forces in check, to keep them manageable so that the vocal folds are not left having to restrain that air pressure. When they do that, the glottal closure mechanism tends to become hyperfunctional, and then it has a really bad snowball effect all the way up the vocal tract because then everything starts to shut down. That's when we start getting muscle tensions and all sorts of issues with the tone and the larynx rising too high for the task. So if we keep this sort of dynamic tug of war opposition between the expiratory and the inspiratory muscles, then we're going to be more successful at mitigating that air pressure and controlling it. We're also going to be slowing down the rise of the diaphragm so that we can pace our breath more appropriately. So my view is that we need to keep both the inspiratory muscles and the expiratory muscles simultaneously engaged throughout our singing, at least until a good portion of the way through our vocal phrases, and right from the onset of sound. Even when we're generating a high subglottal pressure, we do not need to squeeze the abdominal girdle. We don't need to aggressively squeeze and compress that sound. When I'm belting, I definitely feel much more engagement down here with these expiratory muscles, in particular the transverse and oblique muscles. I feel them working much harder. But at the same time, I always keep a little bit of that rib expansion. I keep those inspiratory intercostal muscles a little bit engaged so that they control that subglottal pressure. They keep it manageable because I don't want to be managing it up here. I want to be managing that breath pressure down here with these larger muscles, not with these tiny, delicate vocal folds. So what we're going to find is that the extent to which these inspiratory and expiratory muscle groups are engaged differs from the start of the phrase to the end of the phrase. So at the beginning of the phrase, we have more air in our lungs. We have that overpressure. But at some point along the vocal phrase, as we're expelling the air, lung pressure starts to drop. And once it gets below a certain point, we then have to start engaging a little bit more and compressing that container basically in order to keep the subglottal pressures consistent. Otherwise, if we don't compress that container a little bit more, allowing the ribs to come in, allowing the diaphragm to rise, then we're going to have a drop in subglottal pressure, and then our loudness, our volume, our amplitude is going to decrease, and that's not necessarily what we want to achieve. All right, so I think I'm actually going to stop here. I know when to quit. Yay for me! All right, so in the next video, I will get more into the specifics of breath management and this idea of being able to use the inspiratory hold to gain better control over our subglottal pressures, to be able to vary them at will, to be able to pace our outgoing breath so that we can get through the entire vocal phrase or be able to sustain that single note for several measures. And I'm going to share with you some specific exercises for developing this coordination and applying it to your singing. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about those principles. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Please take a moment to click the thumbs up button to let me know that you appreciated the content of this video, and also take a moment to subscribe so that you'll receive a notification when I get those next breath support videos up.
Hi, cutie. Why does your put or 2 pointed triangles look like a tree?
Oh, my necklace?
Yeah. These two look like a tree.
They do?
Yeah.
Like a Christmas tree, maybe?
Yeah. Why did you throw the phone downstairs?
Because when I'm recording videos, I hate when the phone rings. Just type in YouTube. If you just type in www dot and then type a Y, YouTube will come up. Okay. Okay, Mama's trying to finish the video. Of the appoggio technique. Good reflexes.
I need to go potty. Where's Soraya?
She's going potty. Okay, go potty. Do you have to go potty? Going potty?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hurry up.
Is this still recording?
Yeah, it's still recording, so it's hearing you pee.